John 7. From John 7. You expected me to say Job? But be from John. John 7, starting at verse 21, it says, Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment.
So riddle me this. When do you know and not understand? It's really the riddle, I think, of the book of Job. You know, I used to, years ago, studying it and teaching it, would talk about Job and his righteousness, his godliness, and the friends who were just bad friends, who were, not righteous, ungodly, who needed Job to offer sacrifices for them at the end so God would forgive them. But I have, especially this last year, we taught the book of Job, and as I went through it and really in much finer detail, my kind of perspective from just kind of good and bad changed a bit. To here are just talking about Job and his three friends, which make up the bulk of the book, and all of the parts where they are going back and forth making arguments. But Job and his three friends are really four godly men who understood faith and righteousness and godliness. In fact, to some degree, and when you look at a lot of details that they say, you realize that they knew things that are recorded in Scripture when they didn't have the Scriptures you and I have. That they understood things. Now, we don't really know how. Did they have prophets who told them these things? It mentions that they often searched them out, or they could see and understand these things around them. So from what way they knew these godly principles, we're not really sure. Was God giving them some kind of message directly? Was he sending them prophets that we're unaware of? We're not sure. But they know godly principles. And all of the arguments that especially come from Job's friends are based upon godly principles. And yet, they're wrong. And we know they're wrong because the whole story tells us in the beginning they were wrong about Job, and in the end, they're the ones who need forgiveness from God. And so we understand something that they don't. All four of them are struggling with circumstances where Job has, in a single day, lost all of his family, 10 children, and probably, daughters-in-law and maybe even grandchildren and things. But we know there are 10 children, and 7 sons all had their own houses. So they may very well had their own wives and had their own children. All of his children and their households are gone. All of his servants, who are all the people that occupy his household, that watch over his thousands and thousands of animals, all gone. He loses everything in one day. He loses more in one day than most of us could even imagine. When we think about tragedy, we generally don't think about people losing both of those things. Very often we see even, we saw the fires go through California and people lost, when they say, we lost everything. And very often by they mean they lost everything and their whole house burned down. But it wasn't, we lost all their children too. And so when you look at Job and you see all the catastrophe that comes upon him, it's like, this is mind-boggling. It would be unusual for their day. It's unusual in our day. And they are all grasping with what does it mean. They know a lot of godly principles, and they are trying to use them to figure something out that they don't understand. They know a lot. In fact, Job is considered one of the wisest, richest, most godly men. That's why God, in fact, points him out to Satan. And his three friends, it's like, do you think a man like that would have three ungodly friends? No. They're much like him. They too are wealthy. They too are wise. And they make mistakes in applying their knowledge because they don't understand. And very often, you and I have knowledge and we don't understand. So when I look at them now, I actually do see three great friends that Job had. Bad comforters, but great friends who sat with him for a week in the middle of the ashes of his house until he began to speak. And so the verse that as I thought about this whole week, and as yesterday as I was kind of coming to my conclusions and writing down the things, I said, trying to make some sense of this whole story of Job, I thought about John 7, verse 24, when Jesus said, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." It's easy to make a judgment based upon what we see, right? Now, the truth is, we all do it. You're a parent, and you're in another room, and your child is in a different room, and you hear a crash, and you hear breaking of something. And you come walking in, and they're standing near the thing that just broke. And what do you say? What did you just do? Now, probably 99% of the time, you may be right in knowing they just did something, you just don't know the details yet. But one chance out of 100, they might have just been standing there when something slipped off and broke. Right? That's not normal. It's not going to be typical. But if they told you that story, you'd be like, yeah, I don't think so. You really probably wouldn't believe them. And yet, it's possible it's true. Because sometimes we know, and we're certain, and we have experience that tells us this is the way it is most of the time. But it is that very thing that leads us to that blind spot that says sometimes it's not. And so I want us to look at a couple things. And first off, godly knowledge. And I just picked out a couple of them. They knew the principle of you will reap what you sow. In Job chapter 4, get back over there. So that Job 4 is actually when the discussion of Eliphaz began, that goes all the way into chapter 5. But he mentions something here in verse 8 that he is actually basing part of his argument on. And he says, "As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." Now, Proverbs 22, verse 8, says pretty much the identical thing. And Proverbs 22, verse 8, is written hundreds of years after this part of Job. And Proverbs 22 and verse 8 says, whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of his fury will fail. So that first line of verse 8, Proverbs 22:8 says, whoever sows injustice will reap calamity. The three friends of Job are going to make the conclusion that here is Job with calamity all around him, and they are going to say to him exactly what you would say to your child standing near the broken vase. What did you do? And you would keep at them to tell you the truth. And when they told you things you didn't believe, you would tell them, I don't believe you. Come on, fess up. Be honest now. Better to be honest than I find out later and you lied to me. Parents say all those things. And they got this principle too. And that's exactly what they saw. In Galatians chapter, I didn't put the chapter on there. Chapter 6 and verses 7 and 8. I'm pretty sure it's 6. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. They knew this long before prophets wrote it down in our scriptures. I don't know how. Don't know the process by which they learned it. There's a couple ways they could have learned it, by the way. They could have, think about you and I. We all have a knowledge base. Every single one of us, even from the little ones on up, have a certain amount of knowledge. That knowledge comes from maybe 2 or 3 places. Somebody has taught us, sat down and said, listen, told us about something. So we were taught, or we learned or were taught from experience, where we went out and did it, like, oh, that doesn't work. Or we went out and did something, oh, yeah, that works out really well. We learned from those different ways. Or we went out and we searched, and we began to ask questions. So it wasn't somebody sitting down teaching us as much as it was us going and searching and hunting and trying to find the answers. By the way, Job and his friends all mention that they often searched for the answers to things. They mention that a number of times. And so they had this knowledge that they had learned. And in their experience, how often do you hear somebody say, well, in my experience, right? What does that say? What I have seen is when this happens, it's always that. Right? In the whodunit, Butler always did it. Right? Is it always true that Butler did it? No. Sometimes our experience teaches us something that may be true most of the time. But it is those exceptions that become our blind spot. They become the thing that even though we know, we don't understand. And sometimes it's because of our understanding, because of our knowledge, that we actually have these blind spots. Because our experience has shown, well, it's never that. That we can't foresee it being that. Look at the next one here. In Job chapter 5, and if the word shrewd applies to certain people in certain houses, then that's completely a coincidence. Job 5, starting in verse 12, says, he frustrates the devices of the crafty so that their hands achieve no success. The idea of being crafty is the same term, by the way, that used about Satan. That he was the craftiest, shrewdest, the most conniving of all things God had made. And so he was working his little tricks and working his little, smarts to manipulate a situation the way he wanted it to come out, which was Adam and Eve to be sinners. He didn't just come out and say, listen, you should sin, so God casts you away from him, right? That would be kind of stupid. That's what he wants, but he don't want to tell them that. He's shrewder than that, more crafty than that, he's more cunning than that. He devised a plan to accomplish that. That's what this term means, by the way. So it's not, and you might almost go, well, this is somebody who's kind of smart, kind of wise, yeah, but not godly. It doesn't imply godliness. In fact, it implies the opposite. Kind of wise and smart without godliness. And so, verse 13, he catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end. It's what happens to people who are shrewd like that. Their little attempts to, circumvent rules come to an end. Now, Proverbs 33, verse 10, talk about this very thing. Psalm 33, verse 10. It's like there's not that many. So in Psalm 33, in verse 10, it says, "The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples." And then also in verse 9, the same kind of idea, that God does not let the plans of ungodly people come to pass. He is going to fight them. He is going to make them fail. The nations have sunk in the pit that they have made. In the net that they hid, their own foot has been caught. The Lord has made himself known. He has executed judgment. The wicked are snared in their work of their own hands. So the prophets teach us exactly what Job's friends knew. These guys were not unwise men. They were men who thought they knew, but lacked understanding about that situation. Not about all things, but about the situation with Job. And so they also ask, in Job chapter 8, does God pervert justice? So just kind of flipping back over there, you get on up to chapter 8, and you look at Bildad, the short guy, because he was shoe height. So it's starting in verse 1, Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, "How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind?" Now notice what they're saying. That what he's saying, what they are accusing Job of, all that he is saying, is just being a big bag of hot air. That they're accusing him of not knowing anything. The problem is, Job is just as wise as them. And in this situation, he's even wiser because he has information they don't have. So his questions in his mind are different than theirs. They're looking at the child with the broken vase next to them, and Job is that child with the broken vase next to him, having their parents look at him, and they didn't do it. And they're thinking to myself, I don't know how this happened. Because that's a situation Job's in. He knows he didn't do it. But he doesn't know how to prove it. Because it all looks like he's guilty. And so they say, does God pervert justice? Or does the Almighty pervert the right? They're implying that what has happened to him has been just. They think that what has happened. Now, I want you to understand this. When we call this exactly what they looked at it as. If you have a huge natural disaster happen to you or your house or something, and you go to your insurance company and the insurance company says, that was an act of God. what will they say? Are you insured against acts of God? Sometimes, sometimes not. You better specifically say in this particular act of God it is. Otherwise, it's not. Right? Because they don't want to be responsible for all acts of God. That's an awful lot to be responsible for. But that's what they're looking at Job. These are a bunch of acts of God that have happened to him. How does this happen to one man in one day? This isn't normal. And so that's how they looked at it. They go, this was some kind of godly punishment. It's what it looks like to them. And so they're implying that he is saying, when he's kind of defending himself to some degree, that he hasn't done anything, they are accusing him of being unrighteous. He says, and then he says, they say in verse 4, if your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. What was he saying? Your children died because they were sinners. Now, we know that's not true in this situation. Doesn't mean that they weren't sinners. He understood they might be sinners. That's why he was offering sacrifices for them. But that's not why they died. And so, but they're saying, oh, this doesn't happen to them if they were really good kids. Don't we look at sometimes other people's children and think we know why they're the way they are? Are we right sometimes? Are we right all the time? No. Because what works most of the time, the fact it's implied, it doesn't work all the time. And so, as they go on and say, if you will seek God, in verse 5, if you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you and restore your rightful habitation. And though your beginning was small, your latter days will be very great. Doesn't verses 5 through 7 almost seem prophetic? That's exactly what happens to Job. They said, if this is true, this is what's going to happen. But the problem is they didn't wait around for 30 years to see all that happen. Oh yeah, you really were, weren't you? Because you got all it back, and he made you successful in the end again. Oh yeah, we were wrong 30 years ago, sorry. Because we didn't see the end. We made a snap judgment about a picture in the middle of it. In the middle of the story. Because what happens in the middle of the story? Here's one of the things you almost always know about any movie, book, story you're watching. What happens in the middle act? The heroine or whatever has some kind of failure, collapse. Everything looks bad. Because they have to win. In order to win, you had to be down. You had to lose. And so in the middle of the story, you can't make your final conclusions. And so now understand this. I don't think he was being prophetic. I think he actually understood this principle that God looks after and helps those who are pure and upright. And if something happens to them, he will restore them. And he will bless them so that their latter end is greater than their beginning. They knew that. But Job didn't look like he was in that situation to them. And so, figuring out how we could be right and yet so wrong. Because to me, that's the story of Job. As I have learned and grown in my understanding of the book of Job, this is where I see it now. A lot of good men, understanding the right things, get it really wrong. So I've been thinking for what is it that makes them get it wrong? And I think it's very similar to parents who sometimes get it wrong with their children. And I'm suspecting most adults have a story where you were punished unjustly because you looked guilty. Most of us can probably remember. Now, it might have only been one in our entire childhood, but it stands out to us because I didn't do it. Until Julie lost her brother, a little over a year and a half ago. Every time we got together with her brother and her sister, we learned of the time they argued over, I don't remember if I remember the whole story, they always argued that her brother had done something that got her sister in trouble or vice versa. So 50 years later, they still couldn't let it go. I got in trouble for what you did. And Julie had one too, by the way. Her brother had actually gone down one Christmas morning, had broken the hidden little string that their dad had put up across the stairs. But Julie was the one that was always up early and got in trouble for having broken the string and didn't do it. She remembers that. Love the stories. And they're kind of funny and laugh about them, but they come out of this sense of, I got in trouble unjustly. Now, we don't sit and count up all the times I got away with it. I didn't get in trouble. And I didn't get caught. But, so in the end, we usually got away with more than we might have taken a little unjust punishment. But sometimes parents have a couple of kids who are pointing the finger at each other and are not sure which one did it. And so they both get in trouble. And sometimes only one did it. Because lots of us have siblings who are shrewd. And have calculating, cunning ways to have their siblings get in trouble too. Or sometimes have their siblings get in trouble instead of them. Like the one, like, you should go do that. Go try that. Go touch it. Go grab it. Like the older sibling telling the younger sibling to do something they know they're not supposed to do, so that it's like, well, when it gets eaten, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. They did it. I encouraged them along the way, but we know this stuff happens. We don't always see it, don't always grasp it. We know we have all been kind of in situations like that, where maybe something has happened where we look guilty. And everybody thinks we're guilty. And how do you prove you didn't do it? Let me ask you this. Did anybody believe Job that he didn't do it? No. What do you do when you're in a situation where you look like you're guilty and everybody says you did it? How can you prove, unless you just weren't there? Very often we're kind of just, we have to let the end come out. What's going to happen? Was I righteous in the long run or not righteous in the long run? Sometimes you just can't. You can't answer every kind of whisper somebody might say about you, or people can accuse you. Sometimes accuse you subtly. Well, if they really were righteous, Well, in John chapter 7 there, that passage about Jesus, he's making this point that in John 7:24 that you need to be able to see things beyond the simple, because not everything is really simple. And what he was asking them to see was something they hadn't been explicitly taught about. And so he had been in the temple teaching. The Jews were marveling at all of his teaching, and they're saying, how is it that this man has learning when he's never studied? And what they mean is, not that he wasn't smart, how did he know all this stuff when he hasn't come and studied with all of the really wise theologians here in Jerusalem? That's what they mean by that statement. And so Jesus answered them, he says, my teaching is not mine, but it is his who sent me. And if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. But the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? And a bunch of people in the crowd are like, you have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you? Now, I'm certain a number of the people in the crowd were not aware that the leaders in Israel wanted to kill him. And there were a bunch of people with power and authority who were shrewd and cunning to try and trap him so they could kill him. But a bunch of average people probably didn't know that. I mean, they certainly weren't publishing it. And so he said, I did one work, and that was healing somebody on the Sabbath day. He did it a number of times, by the way, so he obviously didn't shy away from this trouble. He actually kept kind of instigating this issue. But he says, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision. You circumcise a man on the Sabbath. Now, there's a lot of implications there. They circumcised male children on the 8th day after they were born. And that was true even if the 8th day was a Sabbath. And do you know that they had people, at least more modern Judaism, has actual people, moils, that circumcise male children. That's their job. And they are technically working on the Sabbath. But they're not the only ones in Israel that technically work, or maybe even just in reality work. All the priests worked, who were serving and offering sacrifices and doing things. There were exceptions to the basic principle of not working on the Sabbath. And he's making that point to them. And so when he says, listen to this, you do this on the Sabbath, so I come and I heal a whole man. I don't just do a circumcision to connect to the covenant of Abraham. I heal a whole person, and you're like, you can't do that. I'm assuming they're accusing him of being a doctor. But I don't know. Do you think doctors worked on the Sabbath in their time? Let's just not even use doctors for a second. Do you think midwives worked on the Sabbath day when they went and helped women give birth? Or they said, no, you can't do that now. You got to wait 24 hours. Oh, I can't wait 24 hours. There were always exceptions. They couldn't understand that subtle difference. And so they were accusing him, and that's why he said, you can't judge simply by the appearance of something. You've got to be able to see things deeper. That's exactly the problem in Job. They see an appearance. They see the child, broken vase next to them. Maybe they're even having a mitt and a ball. Now you know what they were probably doing. And yet, we didn't see it, did we? And so, most of the time we're right. And sometimes we can be wrong. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, Moses kind of talked to them about the idea of making judgments and how to make righteous judgments. And he actually says 3 times, let's see, Deuteronomy 1:16, it should be, I'm in the wrong chapter. It'd be nice if it was in the right chapter, because I'm like, those verses do not apply. So in chapter 1, in verses 16 and 17, I'll get there eventually. He says, I charged your judges at the time, hear the cases between your brothers, and judge righteously between a man and his brother, or the alien who is with him. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike. You shall not be intimidated by anyone, for the judgment is God's. And the case that is too hard for you, you shall bring to me, and I will hear it. A couple of things. Sometimes we are swayed by people, right? Let's say two people were coming up, and one of them is your friend. Could you judge impartially in that situation? I would hope we could try, but it would be difficult, wouldn't it? Because what if we have our friend that we say, our friend, I just trust him. Trust him with my life. So when he tells me, he's like, well, he's not lying. The other guy I don't know says up and he talks, and he might be the most trustworthy person in the history of the world, but I don't know that. And am I as likely to trust him? Maybe not. Somebody comes up rich and powerful. Another person comes up poor, rags on, looks horrible, smells terrible. Who am I more likely to listen to or trust? Now maybe I have something against rich people. Who am I more likely to side with? See, it can work both ways because our perspective on things is often skewed. Our experience is often not the whole. But the last thing I also want to point out as well, sometimes they're too hard. Sometimes they're too hard for you. Now, in their case, he said you could send that to the temple. The high priest could bring that to God, and God would give them an answer. But just understand that sometimes judging in a situation is hard. Sometimes we can know and not really understand. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. You're going to be reading this, in the near future. It'll be a while down through in the year because we got to go through Psalms after Job. But in Proverbs 3, verses 1 through 8, he says, My son, do not forget my teaching. Let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Now, see, a lot of times we talk about that. It's like, well, you just keep his commandments, right? That's all you got to do. You just keep his commandments. Are his commandments easy? Yeah. And no. A lot of them are simple. And some of them are be just and merciful. Okay. I'll do my best. He says, Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. Don't lean on your own understanding. Sometimes you just don't understand why things are the way they are. I think I remember one of Julie's cousins years ago. She had just miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. There's a whole series of them in a row. Wanted children very, very much, and I remember her quoting this passage. It's like you just sometimes have to lean on trust in God and not your own understanding, because you just don't know why. So why are things the way they are? I don't know. And the truth is, sometimes we don't know. And that's the hard part. Sometimes sometimes we need to get wise enough. We need to grow in enough wisdom to learn to say what I don't know. And that's hard sometimes when we're young, because we think there's an answer to everything. We think there's a right way for everything. And then we grow and we go, things are not always so simple. They're not always so black and white. Some things are just difficult to understand. And sometimes we're just going to have to let God sort it out. And so I wanted this is the point. As I thought all about it, this is, I think, the mistake they make and we make a lot. If A, then B. And so I'm going to give you, that, by the way, is kind of a principle used in philosophy, whether if you take a logic class in philosophy or you take certain math classes where you have to do proofs. Sometimes, there's all these correlations. So if A is true, then B is true. But the problem is, it doesn't work in the reverse. If B is true, does that mean A is true? No, not always. And so let's look at the two examples that I already showed you. You reap what you sow. So God says you keep reaping and you keep sowing iniquity and you keep sowing strife and you keep sowing trouble. That's what you're going to get back. He says if A is true, then the B is going to be true. But if you reap trouble, does that mean you sowed trouble? Very often that's true. But it's not always true. Not true in Job's case, right? It's not true in Jesus' case, right? Did he reap trouble, hatred, anger? Did he sow those things? No. So that the converse, because what we look at the conclusion and say, well, God says, if that's what, this is what happens when you practice this. And even I haven't seen you practice this, you must have been doing that. I've seen brethren do that. I remember watching a rich brother in California many, many years ago, rail to a friend of mine for not being wise with his money. Now, he didn't know at all how he used his money. He just knew that he was always kind of needed financial help. So the rich guy is like, you're just not being wise with your money. You have to be smarter, be wiser. I'm not going to keep giving you money. That was his kind of attitude. Problem was that he didn't understand it. In fact, he was saying the exact same thing. He said that to a friend of mine, but he also said it one time when a preacher, that congregation most of us had known there at the time, had a heart attack. He didn't have insurance. Now, why didn't he have insurance? Now, this same rich guy said, well, that was just foolish to not have insurance. Yeah, he was down there preaching and can barely afford to feed his family and put a roof over their head. And you're going to rail at him. You're going to rail at him because he didn't have enough money. What, do you rail at the church for not supporting them better? So he can afford it? No, I didn't do that. Because we sometimes look at the conclusion and think we know how they got there. And you know what? Most of the time you're going to be right. If you walk in and your child is sitting next to a broken vase holding a ball, most of the time they probably were throwing the ball and broke it. But sometimes weird things happen. And so just the same thing, the shrewd will not succeed. So the cunning, crafty person who tries to manipulate things to be their way is not going to succeed. He says, if that's true, that's going to be your end result. But the truth is, you look at somebody who wasn't successful. Does that mean they were shrewd and cunning and crafty and kind of deceitful? No. Ecclesiastes 9, I didn't put it on here. Ecclesiastes 9 tells us that time and chance happen to all. I think it's 9:11, if I remember right. But in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, you read through there, and he says, See, sometimes he says the race isn't always to the swift. Is the race usually to the swift? Does the faster runner usually win the race? Do they always win the race? You and I have probably seen examples. I can even picture highlights in Olympics where somebody might have been leading and tripped. Isn't it Mary Decker? That's sticking in my head. She tripped or got tripped, fell, leading, gonna win, and lost. In fact, that the swift is not always, or the race is not always to the swift, is really what the story of the tortoise and the hare is about. Right? The hare should always beat the tortoise. And sometimes the hare is a little ADD. And so he says, time and chance happen to everybody. So when there was a collapse, in 07 and 08, did a lot of people lose a lot of money who were foolish? Probably. Did a lot of people who lose a lot of money who weren't foolish? Yeah. Because the time and chance happens to everybody. And that happened, in a collapse in the 80s, happened in a collapse in the 30s. That's what happens. Sometimes you can be the smartest person ever, the greatest thing ever. One of our favorite restaurants got started, and I think it was 07, 06, can't remember, just before the collapse. I mean, it's one of our favorite restaurants to go to. Had some really great dishes, some great barbecue, and some great steaks, and and they couldn't make it through. Could they not make it through because they weren't any good? No. Restaurants had a tough time from about 08 to about 012 or 12 or 13. I mean, there was a tough 4 or 5 years there for restaurants to stay around, because that's just reality of life. So it's making those assumptions that because of what I see, I know the other things I don't see, and they're just not always true. Knowing and not understanding, because they're not really the same.